Okay, so I'm going to kind of talk about persecution, but I'm going to talk about toleration as well. So when you're not persecuting people, what do you do? That kind of thing. So just to frame things, so yes, this is the topic of my PhD. So my PhD specifically looked at a religious minority, namely a group called the Particular Baptists during the 1600s. And I started by reading, there's actually quite a lot of really interesting literature around persecution and toleration during this period. But I got an itch, and like anyone who's done this kind of research knows what I mean. There's a point where you're going, yeah, they're saying it, but they're missing something. And so what I realised was that they primarily talked about what I'll call magisterial toleration, or magisterial intolerance and persecution. Now, I end up going, well, that's part of the story, but there's a bit more. So probably the easiest way to start this off is to show you a diagram that was kind of a main facet of my PhD. Right. Here it is. So, what I want you to get the gist of here is that you have, I'll come back here. So you have the magistracy. Now the magistracy here just basically means rulers. Okay, now those can be political rulers, like kings and stuff, or parliament. It can be legal rulers, such as like judges, those kind of things, or ecclesiastical rulers. They might be bishops and stuff, okay? Now, you have what's called magisterial toleration, and that's what most people talk about. What I mean by that is whether a government should suppress or allow a religious minority. Okay? Whether government should suppress or allow a religious minority. And there was major debate during this period about that very question. And the key thing you have to realise is, I've got a little time frame here. In 1640, pretty much everybody, and pretty much all back from there, everybody thought that religious toleration was a bad idea, that you should persecute religious minorities. Everyone. There wasn't even a debate about that. It was the right thing to do. And the reason you would do that is for several reasons. Not least of all, from a Christian perspective, well, they're wrong and they're heretics. So they're bad. Okay? Think of the very word toleration. You don't tolerate ice cream. Okay? You tolerate lactose. You don't tolerate, you're lactose intolerant. Why? Because for a person who's lactose intolerant, lactose is bad for them. So the very premise of when you're starting to talk about tolerating something is, by definition, it's bad. And people said, well, if it's bad, why would you tolerate it? Get rid of it. It's a good thing to get rid of. Now, over time, people came up with some very interesting arguments about why you would tolerate religious minorities, and we'll talk about those a bit later. By the end, you get 1690, you get the Act of Toleration. And the Act of Toleration is an interesting little beast in and of itself, but it becomes the mainstay for toleration of religious minorities from that point, and people like John Locke and other bunch of people like that, they end up giving very cogent reasons for why you should do that. Okay, so that's the first thing. What I said was that a lot of the dimensions of magisterial toleration were actually going the other way. What I mean by that is, it's not just that the magistrate would tolerate a religious minority. Right, and whether it was tolerant or intolerant. Why did they become a religious minority? Why did they become Baptist? Why did they become Presbyterian? Why did they become that? Because they couldn't stand being Anglican. Which means, by definition, what are they? Intolerant. And from their perspective, it's the right thing to do. Their conscience commanded them that it was wrong to stay Anglican because the Anglicans were bad, and there were any number of reasons for why they thought Anglicanism was bad. But so what that meant was, by definition, the religious minorities were asking the government to tolerate them in their very intolerance. Right? You see what I mean? And from their perspective, it wasn't the nasty kind of intolerance that we're thinking about here. One of the key example of this is a woman called Dorothy Hazard, who in the middle of a church service heard her pastor, her rector, Anglican rector, who just happened to also be her husband, preaching. And he was preaching about how good it was to use images in worship. And what he meant was like, icons and stained glass windows and stuff. She said, that is wrong, and any Anglican church that actually upholds that kind of thing, I cannot be a part of, even my husband's. And so she walked off and she started her own Baptist congregation without any of that trapping. Now, from her perspective, that was the right thing to do. Do you see what I mean? Okay, so you've got that dimension. But then it gets more interesting because as well as that, there's also what I call the dimension of ordinary toleration. And that's between the general population and all of these pesky religious minorities. So what I mean is sometimes you had that the government would suppress the people, that would persecute them. But on the local level, people just turned a bit of a blind eye because so-and-so is great for our community. He helps with this, he helps with that, he's doing great stuff. Yeah, the government doesn't like him, but we'll let it slide. Do you see what I mean? So you had these two dimensions, and when I show you a little later, this period from about 1660 to 1680-ish, it's really interesting. The government starts off, certainly the king, being very tolerant and becomes increasingly intolerant. The populace starts off as generally very intolerant for interesting reasons, and then what happens is they slowly just are hanging around with these really nice nonconformists, these really nice religious minority people, and they actually go, they're not that bad. And then they cut them some slack because they help in the local community, and so they become more tolerant. See what I mean? That's the next thing. And then there's actually, as well as that, interesting dynamics of toleration within those religious minorities themselves. Now I'm going to keep on using the term nonconformist tonight for those religious minorities. The reason for that is because they wouldn't conform to the Anglican Church, the stock standard national church. Okay? Now, point I'm going to make is that, first of all, you take any religious minority, say the Baptists, they had to decide not only how they would relate to the Anglican Church, how they would relate to the government, but as well as that, how they'd actually relate to all those pesky other religious minorities around. So what do they do with the Presbyterians? What do they do with the Quakers? What do they do with the Independents? Do they like them or do they not like them? And that became a really interesting kind of question, which meant that they were showing what I call interdenominational toleration. Okay? Do you see how it's much more multifaceted than you might have originally thought? Now, the next thing is, of course, there's denominational toleration. There can be different, like within the one denomination, like the particular Baptist, there might be a church that just goes down on that particular issue a bit further than everyone else likes. But there's enough about them that is consistent with the rest of the people in the denomination that they go, look, it's a bit crazy, it's a bit off base, but we'll let them slide a bit. Okay, do you see what I mean? And you guys would know in your own denominations, there are churches that are a little bit off, or a little bit different, but you stay, you've got a really good insurance plan, as if you'd really leave, that kind of a thing, right? And then, of course, within even more narrowly, there's congregational toleration. Every congregation, no matter what the church, is a dynamic of toleration, or potentially intolerance. You might say to someone, you cannot be part of this church anymore because you believe this, this, and this, and that's just not how we roll. Or you might have that they perform certain actions, and you go, look, we love you, we respect you, all power to you, but that is just not how we roll. That's intolerance. Equally, there are going to be times where they have to put up with your crap. And you have to put up with theirs because we're meant to love each other, and through Jesus we show forgiveness and grace and all that kind of thing. Do you see what I mean? So actually you can have all of these levels all intersecting with each other. Right? Now what's really interesting is you might have people... Oh no, we'll hold off on that. Okay. So you're seeing the basic dynamics of how I'm talking about this? What I'm going to do now is I'm going to give you a brief timeline of the period that I studied to give you a bit of a framework for how all of this worked out. And to do that, I'm going to use 4 pretty colours. Okay, so let's talk about the 1640s. All right, in the 1640s, right, there's a war in England. It's called the English Civil War, right? And it is based on all manner of fun and games and issues, but okay, it, on one level, is very heavily dictated by religious and political toleration. So, let's talk about what that means for the king to start with. Well, it means that he starts off on top and then, well, things go on a bit of a stiff side, if you know what I mean. Like, basically he gets killed. They chop his head off. Who is they? Well, that would be, first of all, the Presbyterians. So the Presbyterians start at the bottom, and then they take over, and then they have to decide what they're going to do. Now then the question is, how did they take over? Well, they got a really big, impressive army, and that army was called the New Model Army. And it was made up of commoners, and you'll never guess who they got as their best recruits. Nonconformists, Baptists, Quakers, Independents, all this kind of stuff. So what happened was that all of them came into ascendancy during this period, nonconformists, because basically they said, listen, we'll do you a deal. We'll give you toleration for your kooky ideas if you go and help us beat up the king. In the so far? Now, that leaves us with one last colour, and that is the Anglicans. Well, the Anglicans kind of go the same way as the king for a lot of their story. They started off being on the ascent, and then they dipped down with him. Right? So, you with me so far? Now let's do the next part. Let's do the king really quickly. He's dead. Okay? But he has an heir. He actually has 2 heirs. Their names are Charles II, and so this one was Charles I. This is now Charles II and James II. And he's funky. We'll get to him later. So for most of this time, they are out of the picture. Okay? The Anglicans, they can't get out as fast as Charles is, and Charles and James. So they stay. And life sucks for them during this period. It really is rough, and they are grossly not tolerated. You can understand why. Like, they signed up with the king's run off, right? And now they're left in the what are they looking like? Traitors in our midst. Everyone doesn't like them. Right. Now, this is where it gets fun. The Presbyterians come to power during this period through a guy called Oliver Cromwell. But what they find is that these pesky religious minorities now actually have quite a lot of control. See, once they got... The Presbyterians tried a very clever trick. They said, we'll get you to help in our army, and then we'll give you religious toleration. And all the religious minorities went, yeah, that sounds great. Then what happened was that the religious minorities finished the war, and the Presbyterians said, that's great, you can go home now. And they went, well, no, actually, we like this whole power thing, that'd be really handy. And so they actually became quite a formidable force in and of themselves. Specifically, in particular, the particular Baptists. The Baptists in this period became part of the role of government. So during this period, Baptists are really quite powerful. They also proved to be rather pig-headed, stubborn, young, arrogant, and brash. And very idealistic, but not smart enough to actually know how to play with that idealism very well. And so subsequently what happens is by around about 1658, things are not going to plan. Oliver Cromwell's dead. His son, Richard Cromwell, is not that good. And so what happens is a remarkable thing. The restoration of the English monarchy. Up it goes. And everyone goes, Charles, we're really sorry about that whole chopping your dad's head off thing. How bad? Come home, baby. Come home, Charlie. So Chuck comes home. What does this mean? This means that the Anglican Church is restored. Now, to be fair, at the beginning, Charles was very, very kind. And he said, I actually want the Presbyterians and the Anglicans to play nicely together. And why can't we just all get along? Okay? Why can't we do that? Because, you've got to understand Charles, he doesn't want to tick these people off because they just brought him back and they killed his dad. So he's trying to play nice. He even extends to the religious minorities that, look, they don't have to go under the table. It's okay. They just need to chillax, right? But as long as they're well behaved, he did a thing called the Declaration of Breda, which basically said, as long as you're good little boys and girls, you can do what you want. It's okay. But then the Anglicans really kicked up a stink, and they forced the Presbyterians, through the king, to do something else. They turned them from being kind of rivals for the national church in England to being nonconformists, out with the nutbags like the Baptists and the Quakers and everyone else. And they became the dominant church. As well as that, so did the king. But this became a very interesting, messy mix, because on one hand, the king was trying to be all very tolerant and understanding and all nice and everything like that, at the same time as he had a parliament run by Anglicans who really hated the guys that had done this to them. Do you understand what I mean? So, vengeance is nigh, the Anglicans said, and we're going to really, crack down on you guys. These guys had it really rough, and it got rougher by around, depending on your point of view, during this period it gets worse, and then it gets really worse. And now, their narrative is deeply entwined with these guys. Right? You with me so far? So during the 70s, that gets really bad, because by that point, a series of things have occurred, which I'll talk about in a minute, that subsequently mean Charles doesn't like them either. Charles starts to not tolerate them either, right? And I'll talk about why in a little while. So suddenly, these guys and these guys become really good mates. And throughout this period, you get a lot of antsiness, a lot of really nasty fighting and everything like that. And this is the period where you get things like Pilgrim's Progress being written. And Pilgrim's Progress is, of course, largely about this kind of dynamic. You might remember the Vanity Fair trial in that, which is kind of rough. So things really suck. And then, in 1680, a new thing comes in. James, so Charles is still king, Charles II, but James of York, his brother, comes out with a little dirty secret. And that secret is he's Catholic. At this point, Catholic's not a good thing from an English point of view. And so they have what's called the exclusion crisis, which is a series of things where they say we should kick James out of the line of succession. He shouldn't be the heir to the throne, because if we get a Catholic in, things are bad. Didn't he? Can you smell the religious toleration in that? The Anglicans, their response to that is, look, nobody's perfect. If they're Catholic, it's not great, but it's better than anything else that we have. So you know what? Bygones. Okay? All of that people get a bit antsy about. And then in 1683, right, these guys join forces to do something very interesting. All right, so this is called the exclusion crisis. Exclusion. And then in 1683, you have what's called the Rye House Plot. And the Rye House Plot is an assassination attempt upon the king and his brother. And you'll never guess who is most heavily involved in that. Baptists. We were the Al-Qaeda of 1683. Okay? Subsequently, that didn't pull off, and the government caught wind of it, and that led to even more serious persecution, right, leading to right, 1685, when finally, getting my colours, I'm doing okay here, right? Finally, Charles II dies, and James II comes to the throne in 1685, right? Now, here's where things get really funky, because two things happen in 1680 in this very same period. First of all, there's a full-scale rebellion led by Charles II's bastard son, called James, Duke of Monmouth, to kill James, destroy the government, and put in a nice, shiny Protestant government led by these guys. They failed, and that is called the Monmouth Rebellion, we'll call it MMR. And then what happens is straight after that, there's a thing called the Bloody Assize. And the Bloody Assizes are a series of vicious executions with fairly shaky legal grounds of anyone and everyone involved in the rebellion, especially these guys, right? And it's not everyone, it's lots. Around about 400 people are executed in around about a month. 400 people executed by the state in a month. Oh, and then they got their bodies pickled, tarred, and hung their body parts all over the West Country for a year. Just to teach everyone a lesson about how James rolls. But then the most remarkable thing happened. James switches sides, because you're thinking, well, like these are followed. Well, you'll never guess what happened. What happens is that despite things getting worse and worse, suddenly, up these guys come, as do these guys, right? And they're suddenly part of the government, and the Anglicans are out on their butt. Pretty much, like they're really out on the butt. Why? Because James II says this, look, the problem isn't Catholics. You think the problem is Catholics, and that's why you went to war against me and everything like that. Really, the problem isn't Catholics. It's Anglicans, because they're so intolerant. The fact is, you're a religious minority. I'm a religious minority. I'm a Catholic in a strange land. Can't we all just love one another? Wouldn't that be all nice? Let's ditch the Anglicans. Don't worry about the Anglicans anymore. Instead, let all be buddy-buddy. All of us poor nonconformists. Catholic, Baptist, Presbyterian. We're all feeling the pain together. Let's cuddle. And a bunch of them go, hell yeah, that sounds great. We'll totally do that. Right? And they actually join a thing called the regulators, who seek to basically sneak into Parliament as many people and fudge the numbers so that James can actually inaugurate a full indulgence forever for every religious minority to have complete freedom. Most people think that James II was this vicious dictator. He actually wasn't. He wanted to bring about this massive change. Okay, it's fascinating. Right? The problem was that the Anglicans, they did not go down without a fight. And so what they did is they invited a guy called William III, who was James's son-in-law, to come over and become the King of England, and they ditched James. When that happened, these people, interestingly, found themselves kind of here, but they were still above the line, as did the Presbyterians, who are now kind of mixed up with this. Anglicanism stayed. William comes in, and that's the end of the story. Okay. Now that's pretty rough and quick, but it gives you a basic idea of how this all was working. The point that I want you to realise is how much religious toleration and things like that are deeply intertwined in this, and how much persecution really depends on the flavour of the day. Okay. From an Anglican point of view, these guys don't think they're persecuting. One of their people said, it's only persecution if they're right, but they're not. So it's just prosecution. We are prosecuting people who are not loyal to the throne, loyal to the king, and not doing things the way the king likes. It's just basic prosecution. You see what I mean? But increasingly, these people, the religious minorities, insisted that it was persecution and framed things in such a way that it looked like it was. And we'll talk about that in a minute. Okay, so having done that, I want to just frame things in one more way, and then I'll start to talk about a few other things here. Finally, one of the key things that my PhD brought out, which hadn't been brought out before, was a guy called Christopher Blackwood. And Christopher Blackwood was a Baptist, and he was particularly prevalent during this period, okay, during the 1650s, yeah, a little in the 1640s as well. And he wrote a book called The Four Treatises, which talked about 5 types of Christian unity. And if you understand these 5 kinds of Christian unity, it might be really helpful for you as we go into the next phase of my talk. So, just give me a second and I'll just get that up. Okay. So, Blackwood was quite famous. He was called the Oracle of the Anabaptists in Ireland. He worked in Ireland for most of this period. Don't hold that against him. During this period where there was some type of attempt to have a non-Anglican national church, Blackwood admitted that a solution to how the Presbyterians and the Baptists and the Independents would all interact seemed impossible. He said, these contentions we have are about religion, conscience and duty, wherein we cannot give way. So ultimately then, Blackwood saw only 5 options for unifying the national church. And these were, and I'll write the words down for you, unity of authority, verity, persuasion, they couldn't spell, right? Necessity, and charity. These were your 5 options for how you tolerate each other, how you can be unified as a people together. And so let's talk about unity of authority. The unity of authority, he says, is the magistrate compelling all to such a practice. Right? That's where the government tells you what to believe and everyone just does it because the government tells you to. That is what they'd been fighting against. As religious minorities, they were sick and tired of governments doing that. He went on to say, whether the remedy will not be worse than the disease, as it would make only God's people begin conforming themselves against their own light. So what he was saying was, the problem with this whole thing of forcing people to, conform to a national religion is that in their hearts they don't. They might, wag their tails like a dog, and they might do what they're told and yap when they're meant to and all that kind of stuff. But the reality is, in their heart, they will not change. Okay? They are only outwardly looking that. Okay? These people honour me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me, the Bible says. God says in the Bible. And what does God measure us by? By our lips or our heart? By our heart, what we genuinely believe. We can be hypocrites and pretend that we believe something, but really what matters is what's in our heart. And so apart from the fact that it's wrong to force people, which was part of his argument, he said the problem with this unity by authority is that it doesn't actually allow you to do any effective evangelism, basically. Because what happens is that if I make you all be Baptist, which of course you should be because we're awesome, if I make you all be Baptist, the problem with making you all Baptist is in your hearts you're not, right? But what if God's saying the only true Christian is a Baptist? Because of course, why wouldn't he? And then what happens is that you're all pretending to me that you're a Baptist when you're not. Well, then what happens is that when you die, you go to glory, and God says, you tricked everyone else, but you didn't trick me. I knew what was in your heart. So what they argued was liberty of conscience. Right? His argument against this is what you should be allowed to do is not only believe what you want to believe, but be able to express what you believe. Because if you can just be honest, then at least if Baptists are right, which of course we are, then what that means is when you say, actually, you know what, I'm not, I'm a Quaker, or I'm a Presbyterian, or I'm an atheist, then at least I can then talk to you about it. And if I'm right, which of course I am, then what I'll be able to do is convince you of that. But there's no way that I'm going to try to convince you if I don't know that you're not thinking the same way as me. Right? Do you see what I mean? Right. That sentence didn't quite work, but you know what I mean. Like, if I think that you're on the same page as me, we just roll along on merrily life. But if what happens is that I know that you disagree with me, we actually have the opportunity for robust discussion and debate until we discover the truth. Do you see what I mean? So this one doesn't work. Right? Another option was unity of verity. Verity here means truth, where, quote, many learned divines had determined things exactly. So what this is you get a bunch of theological experts to sit down, work things out. We all talk together from our various points of view. You say that, and I say, well, that's a good point, but what about this? And you go, yes, that's a very fine point. And you basically leave it up to the academia to work out what's right. And then they tell everyone, and then everyone agrees with them. For some reason, Blackwood didn't think that'd work. He said, on the basis of this, the problem with this is perspective. The variety of sight of many divines had led people to have judged and despised one another, assuming no truth of grace in the contrary party. In his own day, he'd seen the world of Twitter, right? He'd seen the world of that the variety of perspectives doesn't actually make you go, you know what, everyone, you've got such a great point, and thanks for being so learned and giving such sophisticated arguments. No, you're just going to think everyone's a tool. And what you'll do is you'll argue with them to and fro, your egos will get boosted, and you will get less unity out of that than you would if you bothered with anything else. Moreover, ignorance, he says, ignorance and distempered passions, he really was talking about Twitter, destroy truth's ability to bring unity, especially once people move away from the general ideas they agree upon and begin, quote, proceeding too far to particulars. It's great. It really is interesting, isn't it? His basic point is, you might get the learned people on side, but all the idiots will still yell at each other. All the plebs will argue and viciously bite at each other, and more as you get into the specifics, right? And the specifics will actually outweigh your energy and your focus more than all of the stuff that you actually agree on. You ever notice this? You can get into vicious theological arguments with people that when you actually just stop and say, just so we're clear, that Nicene Creed thing that we're all meant to agree on, we all still agree on that. And you go, yep, I believe, yeah, I believe all of these. And so do you? Yeah. So why are we arguing about whether it's God's will for the table to be on that side of the room as opposed to the other one? Because God wants us to argue. Like, it's really strange. You know what I mean? Right? This is his point. Others suggested a unity of persuasion, of encouraging mutual dialogue to share each other's arguments. Right? This is kind of taking the verity one now, just letting it open slather. It's not just about letting the the educated do it, now let's make everyone else. While this showed some potential, Blackwood argued most people would retain their already existing convictions anyway, even if proven wrong. Okay? So far we've found this one doesn't work, this one doesn't work, this one doesn't work. It's really not looking good. Okay? But then he argued, well, what about a unity of necessity? Where, quote, the danger of a general enemy is like to unite us. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. And this is a fairly long quote from him. He says, it's true. A foreign enemy is a reconciler of brethren, and common danger holds them together as long as it lasts. But one, this unity of necessity may perhaps be only so long as this necessity lasts. For when one side hath no need of the other, such unities cease to exist. And two, the unity of necessity is only pro renata. That means, for the moment, not the union of their spirits. For though against a common enemy they are united, yet still in other things they are disunited. He's writing this, by the way, 5 years after the Civil War had ended. And during the Civil War, these guys had become very closely entwined together, these guys, because of a unity of necessity. They had a common enemy, and the common enemy was the king and all that kind of stuff. But once he was out of the way, it was amazing how quickly those became competing forces arguing with each other. And so he said, you might be buddy-buddy with your enemy, the enemy of your enemy for a while, but sooner or later, the enemy is gone. Then you're still left with the same crap you were arguing about before. That's the first point. And second of all, one of the things I noticed was everyone's great at arguing what the problem is and joining forces around the problem. Once you get past that sticky thing and you have to start figuring out what the solution is, it's amazing how they start to argue about that. Okay? So we'll talk about that in just a second. All right. For Blackwood then, the only solution left was what he called unity of charity. Either side to bear with the judgment of the other in all due Christian moderation. Either side then to abate when they can. Now the terms to bear with someone, to abate that someone, is a term of toleration. Have you ever had to bear with someone? Like, oh, I can't bear them. I'm bearing with them. Hold on. That is you tolerating them because they're irritating the crap out of you. Do you understand? So already he's talking in toleration terms, but he says specifically, Blackwood's unity of charity envisaged different denominations existing throughout Britain with without any central authority from above. So no bishop, no diaconate, nothing like that. From below, in congregations, they would also not be forced to meet together, instead respecting each other's right to worship independently. So your congregation can be run your way, I'll run mine my way, and we'll all do it independently, but we'll collaborate on things of national importance. Okay, you with me so far? All right. Tangible expressions of unity were limited to duties of love and kindness, as sending of gifts to one another, and mutual counselling, mutually lending, mutual helping. This would include the various groups engaging in, very important word, brief, mutual visitings, and mutual entertainment in a way of hospitality, but permanently joining in worship together was not encouraged. Thus, Blackwood's ideal model for interdenominational toleration was this one of, look, we'll come together, we'll have a few ecumenical events, we'll, hang out together a bit, if there's a crisis or something like that, we'll work together on that national crisis together, and we'll put aside all of our denominational emphases and baggage. But at the end of the day, you worship God your way, I'll worship God my way, because if we try to actually stick those together, right, we just won't like each other. It'll get too rough. Have any of you guys ever had this kind of a dynamic where, like, you know people, like in this room, I know people from different denominations. And you all go and you worship God in your own way, in your own church, in different ways. Right? All power to you in that. I like that we come together in a thing like this and we show open dialogue and mutual respect and everything like that. But I wouldn't want to worship in your churches for a year or two. And I'm pretty sure you wouldn't want to worship in mine. And that's okay. Right? Like, you know, I'm not a Pentecostal. My arms can only go this high. You know, like, right? I could never become Orthodox. My sinuses, I mean, the smoke, it'd just do me in, you know, right? I'm not actually disparaging there, I'm making lighthearted, but effectively, you know my point. My point is, I just don't meet God that way, you know? And I wouldn't want to inflict upon you all of the idiosyncrasies that are Baptist worship, right? If that's not your thing, that's fine. You worship Jesus, you do you. You do you with Jesus, and that's fine. But if there's a national crisis, do you remember the bushfires that were up in Kersbrook a little while ago? It was awesome because all these churches from all different walks of life all collaborated together to work together to help the poor farmers who were affected by that. Do you see what I mean? Right? You might think of the disastrous, you know, issues facing the church from the point of view of the Royal Commission. Well, it'd be really dumb for all of us to say, just we'll take care of our own. No, we've got to have a collaborative response to that, to come up with good, responsible practices for the sake of our kids. Now, at the end of the day, we'll all go off in our own way and we'll do things our own way in terms of, like, you know, how we worship and stuff. But collaboratively, we'll work on a problem that works for everyone. Do you see what I mean? So that is his idea of unity of charity. Now, what I think is really interesting is that we live in a time where this one, people want to try this one, increasingly in our culture. People want to try the authority one. And I think we as Christians have the right to say to them, we've seen how that works before. Enforcing uniformity upon, like, mind policing the population, it just don't work. 2, the verity one, I think it's good that we have various academics debating and discussing things, and that adds something, right? Podcasts are great, but the reality is that will not achieve unity. He's right. Persuasion, go on Twitter for 5 minutes. It doesn't work. Necessity. Necessity is very, very, very attractive and works in short bursts, like a national crisis around a particular thing. But if we're trying to say that we're all going to come out of that unified in a deep sense and we're all going to start worshipping the same way, forget about it. It's just not going to happen. The only one that seems to... this one's kind of like you're half right. It's good. But the reality is, once we actually iron out the kinks of whatever the problem is, we're not going to get on with each other. And then finally, the charity one is a great one, okay, within certain limitations. Interestingly, while he is arguing for this unity of charity, he didn't look like he did a very good job of it during his own career, Christopher Blackwood, because he just, like other people, said that he was grossly intolerant. So this is what one person wrote of him. He said, those blazing meteor-like comets, those unchristian, rough, threatening Anabaptists, for I speak of them, that rather than lay aside their form, they will see all the differing saints in the world ruined and help to torment and persecute themselves, and lay more weight upon their doubtful ordinance than they would do, than they do upon the undeniable and absolute ordinance of love. So that was a guy, John Rogers, arguing that people like, Blackwood were very intolerant. What he didn't realise was that he tried to get a congregation of people who were Presbyterians, Baptists, and a bit of Independents and a bit of everything to all come in and worship together. And Blackwood just went, That's just not going to work. Like, you do you. You stick us together with you, things are not going to go well. Okay? So, I think that gives us some very useful lessons for how we approach toleration, but also persecution. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is who were the people who were most intolerant, particularly when you base in this. One of the common presumptions, and this will take about 5 or 10 minutes, one of the common presumptions that we can have in our culture is that we think the relativists are the more tolerant people, because they say, look, you believe what you believe, I'll believe what I believe, we'll respect each other. And the people who are considered to be the most intolerant are the people who are what we'll call absolutists. The people that think they're definitely right, and that there is a real thing such as right, and there is a real thing such as wrong. Right? It makes sense, doesn't it? You'd think that the relativists would say, who knows what the right answer is, so you do you, I'll do me. Right? You'd think that's the case. How's that working out? How to work out here? The Anglicans in this period are noted for being what they called latitudinarian. What that means is they gave a lot of latitude to what the truth was. Okay? Latitudinarian is just relativists before they figured out they could use less syllables. Okay? So you have this latitudinarian, yep, right, equals relativist. Relativists. It's more complicated than that, but that'll do for the moment. Okay? The Anglicans were primarily that. They were also, if you look at this, the most intolerant of the whole lot. And do you know why? Because these guys insisted that another facet to this was what was called moderation. And what they meant was, the problem with you people is that you get too excited. You know the story of Goldilocks and the Three Bears? Right? Just, what's the best kind of porridge? Porridge that is neither hot nor cold, just right. When that story was originally written, it was written by an Anglican. And Goldilocks wasn't in there. It was about the three bears. And the lesson was, you don't want stuff that is too hot, you don't want stuff that is too cold, you just want what's just right, in the middle. And the problem was that all these nutbag nonconformists were being too hot, too cold. Why can't they just chill and just be all just in the middle? Okay? So what that meant was that actually the latitudinarians, they became the most intolerant. And the reason why? The reason why, because they said, these guys are fanatics. They hold their beliefs too tightly. They get so uppity about things that really don't matter, like the Trinity. You know, things like that. They care about their morals. They insist that things have to be done a right way. They insist that things actually like truth and justice matter. Whereas if they just calmed down and just went, oh, well, that's garbage anyway, then everything would be fine. Isn't this interesting? Yeah. So, you might be sitting here and going, okay, so that explains why the relativists would actually be the intolerant ones, but surely these guys are intolerant too. Well, they are and they aren't. It comes back to the unity of charity idea. They recognised that trying to force people to do what you don't want is counterproductive. Forcing people to believe what they don't want to believe is counterproductive. All it does is it gets in the way. If I actually believe that there is a real truth out there, if I actually believe that there's a right and a wrong, well, I have to accept the thing of, if you and I disagree, one of us is probably, certainly to some degree, off base. Okay? There might be aspects of things that we can both agree on. There might be aspects where we're a little unsure and so we cut each other some slack. But there are going to be things where if you're really disagreeing with me on a really important issue, one of us is wrong because I believe that there's an absolute truth. So there must be a wrong answer. And you know what? I got to be brave enough to admit it could be me. So what that means is not that we just go, there is no truth, so just stuff it. What we do instead is we say, let's talk about it. Convince me. Be honest. You think this? Hit me with it. Give me your side of the story. I'll give you mine, and we'll argue, and we'll be robust, and we'll be respectful, because we're all, even if we're disagreeing about what that truth ultimately is, we both agree that there is a truth that we're trying to get to. So, for example, I could actually sit with a Muslim, to use an extreme example, and to be interesting, they use this one as well. They said, as an extreme example, I might sit down with a Muslim and I might say, you think this, and it is hell and gone from what I believe. But forcing you to pretend that you're a Christian, or me, forcing me to be a Muslim ain't going to help anyone. The best hope that we've got is if we robustly discuss it with each other. Okay, do you see what I mean? So actually the absolutists, precisely because they believed that there was one single ultimate truth, they had to recognise if you disagree, one of us is off base, we have to talk about it. We have to figure it out. We have to keep on debating. This is where this kind of unity of verity persuasion becomes somewhat attractive, because what it allows is, look, you at the end of the day, you go do you, I'll do me, and everything like that. But ultimately, we can at least agree to keep talking to each other and being honest with each other. Right? So the absolutists, precisely because they believed in an absolute truth, had to agree to keep on talking until they got a clearer perception of what that truth was. Right? What that meant was that they were pretty darn sure they were right. The Baptists were very certain they were right. But actually, precisely because they knew, in their hearts, they were pretty darn sure they were right, they weren't afraid of robust discussion. Okay? If I'm right, why would I be afraid of you having a contrary view? Why would I feel threatened by that? Why would I need to persecute you about that? Because, just 2 seconds, because if I'm right, the truth will win. I trust that the truth will win. If we keep on talking it out, it'll actually work out. The person who was most threatened by the idea of there being an absolute truth was not the absolutist, it was the latitudinarian. This leads to the last point that I want to make, and that is Alexandra Walsham, who is a resident expert on this whole dynamic of toleration in England during this period. She talks, as I do, around cycles of intolerance. And this is the last point I want to make. The response of why do you end up with Baptists who during this period are actually writing things like God Save the King, right? Welcome back, Charlie. We're happy to have you home. Why do they go from that to trying to assassinate him and then a full-scale rebellion? Because they are pushed to it. These people continually attack them, lock them up, fudge juries to try to get false things, attack them in print, attack them in any way they can to suppress them. How do these guys respond? These guys respond by increasing a rhetoric of we are not being prosecuted for doing the wrong thing, we are being persecuted for doing the right thing. So ultimately, why do they do that? Because they think that the persecution is against a righteous cause and they must defend themselves. You prod someone long enough, eventually they get really sick and tired of it and they just punch you back. See, I think the latitudinarians of our own day have to realise this. You keep pushing people long enough and they get ticked. That's not a justification for when they do, but it's not a great way to live. The other interesting thing is, do you remember me telling, and this is my last point really, how you had the magisterial toleration go from really tolerant to really intolerant during this period, and then what happened was that the ordinary population went from being very intolerant to being tolerant. The general population was disgusted at what had happened to Charles I, executed. They thought that was wrong. They thought that these years had been very dysfunctional. And so when Charles came back, they cheered for Charles, but they also wanted these guys hammered. The local populace over time switched, and the reason they switched was because they saw how noble and kind and like martyrish the nonconformists were in the face of all of the Anglican prosecution and persecution. So ultimately they developed a sympathy. Here's the thing, in our own day where we have to, you just got to watch yourself if you are the kind of person who is this kind of latitudinarian who insists that anyone who disagrees with you is some nutbag fanatic. You just got to realise the lesson of history with that. If you take that kind of an approach, a unity of authority, the results aren't good, because often that leads up the people that you're suppressing to eventually get to the point where they don't turn the other cheek anymore. Right? I'm not condoning that, but I am saying it's a historical reality. But even more than that, the local populace start getting really, really irritated by you just squashing everyone all the time for the sake of calming everyone down. And you actually start to look like you're crazy. You're accusing everyone else of being a fanatic. Everyone actually starts looking at you and going, I'm not sure they're the fanatics. I'm pretty sure you're the fanatic for squashing us all down all the time. And then you actually see the tide turning and people actually starting to criticise the people who were so open-minded but don't actually look that open-minded anymore. Right? Okay. These are lessons that I think are actually quite useful for a lot of people today. Right? And they tell us about how we treat each other when we disagree. Right? Let's have a break, and then we can have a bit more chat. Thanks.
I'll just kick things off. I remember watching a film years ago about Oliver Cromwell, and at one stage he was getting all this support from his troops, and I think this is what he said to them: I appeal to you by the bowels of Christ to consider the possibility that you might be wrong. Did he actually say that, and what was the guy like?
Oh, Cromwell is a fascinating topic in and of himself. So I don't know if he said those specific stuff, but he does spend a lot of time being really frustrated with how the people that are from different religious backgrounds, like basically his national church is a mishmash of Presbyterians, Baptists and Independents. And he was really frustrated at how much time they spent arguing about words. So I'll see if I've got the quote. It shouldn't take me too long to find.
I've got another quote.
Yeah?
Trust in God, keep your powder dry.
Keep your what, sorry?
Yeah.
Powder dry.
Speak left. Speak softly and carry a big stick.
So it's like that, yeah.
I'll see if I've got it here. He said things like, you know, you guys are arguing about pointless things while our enemies are at the door. So he was actually in a war with the Dutch. He had a lot of better things to be doing with his time, but he found that a lot of his parliaments were taken up with arguments about this kind of stuff. Cromwell is fascinating because historians really argue about how much you can say that he was tolerant. Because if he was tolerant of religious minorities that other people weren't, so mainly Baptists and those kind of things. He did show toleration to Sabellians, who were kind of anti-Trinitarians during the period, Quakers to an extent.
What was he himself? Was he Presbyterian?
Yeah, ish.
So,
Yeah, pretty soft on his Presbyterianism. Like, very devout man in his way, but yeah. The issue, of course, with him that we haven't talked about is, and we were talking about this during the break, is his treatment of Catholics, which wasn't great, particularly in Ireland. But even with the Irish thing, this is the other factor. A lot of the time, religious persecution is window dressing for what you really want to do.
Yes.
And so, at the end of the Civil War, he's got this massive army. It's got like 50,000 people, the new model army. He has no money to pay them. There's no money to pay them. So what are you going to do? Well, in English history, there's two ways that you pay people: cash and land. He didn't have enough cash. So he went, well, look, all of you significant generals and colonels and stuff like that, let's just turn you into lords and you can have some land. Now, there wasn't enough land in England to go around, but there was this lovely piece of real estate down south, and that was Ireland. And so he did persecute the Irish, the Catholics there. But it wasn't, I hate Catholicism, I will rip it to shreds. It was, I need land, and these people are on the land, and I really don't like that they got that land, and if they were dead, it would be great. And they're only Catholics anyway. Do you see the difference? Right? Now, that doesn't make it right. Like, it's terrible that he was like that. But just understanding that it's not driven by religion so much as it's driven, or religious intolerance, it's driven by greed and necessity in some extent, economic concerns, rather than because of religious motivations. In fact, the most vicious people to, doing a lot of his dirty work in Ireland, wasn't Cromwell himself, it was actually his generals, because he said to them, if you want the land, go take it. And they went, great. So you're telling us we can go kill them so that we can have the land? And they went, yeah, you give that a good shot. Right.
But he chose them because of their religion. So
of course
how
he
can
did.
you say that's not religious persecution?
I'm not. What I'm saying is that it is, but it's not entirely religiously motivated or even primarily religiously motivated. I'm saying that the prejudice of that is not the prejudice of I must destroy all Catholics. It's rather, I need land, I destroy the people who are there, they're only Catholics anyway. Right? That doesn't make it right. I'm really not saying that it makes it right. I'm just saying that it's primarily driven by economics first, and then by everything else. So that means that if you're going to have a go at it, have a go at it for the economics first, and then the religious stuff. Seriously, have a go at him for being willing to kill people for the sake of economic gain. That's deplorable. In a lot of ways, it's actually worse.
What else could he have done if he couldn't pay his own?
That's an excellent question. On one level, and this comes to your point about necessity, you could argue that he's driven to that by the necessities of his age. But any number of people are driven to do deplorable things because of the necessity of the age. It doesn't make what they do right. That's a fun ethical question to wrestle with. But I'm not going to say that, well, he had no choice other than losing the throne or killing tons of Catholics in Ireland.
What should he have done?
I have no idea. Probably the idealist in me wants to say that he should have gone, I'm sorry, fellas, we don't have the land, I can't pay you, and the whole thing would have fallen flat really quickly. And that's an interesting question.
But he thought of it, so therefore he is guilty in that regard.
Yeah.
We would regard that as genocide now.
We would, exactly.
We don't know whether he tried to borrow because, rulers have borrowed for years and just given people the right to recover by letting whoever lent the money tax their people. It's fascinating as an ethical question,
It is, yeah.
right? But you can see already it's starting to migrate to questions of necessity, questions of a government's survival. Other factors come in terms of where he was going to get the cash. Could he have borrowed it? Well, a lot of lenders weren't thinking he was a good sell.
Was it also to get rid of the most war-hungry generals? They're busy over there, not...
Oh, yeah, no, that's a really good question.
Distance.
So that comes to a thing that I didn't bother telling you about, which is that a lot of the people who went over made life a living hell, for the actual ruler of Cromwell's island, and that was his son, Henry. Henry, I actually do have that quote right here. This is what Henry said about He really didn't like them that much. And he found them really frustrating. He said, the Anabaptists, here we go. Can His Highness, this is Henry Cromwell talking to his dad, Oliver, can His Highness believe that the Anabaptists, and especially those here, to be His best and most faithful friends? Let us not be deceived. Right? He didn't trust them as far as he could throw them, because these Baptist generals, what Henry suspected was that the Baptist generals were going to get the land for themselves, but then they'd set up an independent state of Ireland themselves and basically backstab the Cromwells. So, yeah.
Did Latimer and Ridley, they were here before this?
Way before, yeah. Yeah,
No, that
good
was
100
in-
years.
in Mary's time.
Yeah.
So, I've got a question. What do you think God thinks of all of this?
Yeah, oh, dude, that's a really big question. It depends on what you mean.
I mean, who would he allow into the pearly gates, I guess?
Well, if you ask Bunyan, Bunyan's very specific on that.
Yeah, yes, but he's had a view. I'm now talking about God who's above it all, hopefully.
Yeah. Okay.
So would it be somebody on either side who showed mercy to somebody else?
Yeah, so from...
And that's what I'm really getting at, is that it's either side is going to make it. It doesn't matter about the final points of what they were maybe arguing about.
Okay, so there's two dynamics to that. And I will use Bunyan as an example because I think Bunyan's actually helpful here. So if you look at things like Pilgrim's Progress and stuff like that, Bunyan never refers... Bunyan's a Baptist. He never refers to his heroes in either Pilgrim's Progress 1 or Pilgrim's Progress 2. He never describes them in denominational terms. So, for example, as a Baptist, how easy would it be for him to make the hero, Christian, get baptised? Water is never used as a sign of making a salvation or conversion step in Pilgrim's Progress. Any of you guys who've read it know what I mean. It is used as a symbol for depression, and it is used as a symbol of death. So for him, God, and basically the death ones are pretty significant here. It's what happens when you're just about to go into heaven. You have to cross through the Jordan. So the Jordan is his metaphor for going into heaven, dying. Okay? Now the point that I'm trying to make is that for him, you can be faithful, Christian, hopeful. These are his heroes. You can be mercy. You can be all of those things and not actually have a denominational label. What defines you as coming across, being able to get across the other side is love, hope, and charity. Like charity in a broader sense. Faithfulness, compassion, and integrity. Integrity, and also, like, to an extent, having a godliness, a godly theology, but actually it's the character that you show. Right? Now, if you said to him, so that means I can have all of that character without actually having a faith in Jesus, he'd say categorically not. But what he does make very plain in that book is that there are plenty of people espousing a faith in Christ that actually don't have that character. And that the people who don't have that character, who espouse their faith, are the people who usually latitudinarian, slack in their faith, and grossly cruel to anyone they disagree with. So, yeah.
Whoever. Go, John.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Look, it's a little bit out of your time frame, but just during the Reformation part of things, a lot of the clergy went from Anglican to Catholic, I think. I'm not sure if they did the 4, but they certainly did the 3. How flexible were the clergy in the National Church across
During
that
this
time
period?
Yeah, particularly in the early bit when...
Okay, that's a really interesting question. There's two sides to that question. Let's first of all talk about the clergy in terms of this flipping thing. Yep. You do get some really interesting flips. So you sometimes get people who go from being on this more non-conformist thing, and they actually start to feel that sense of extremism and flip and become Anglican and just say, look, it would be much better if we were all just chilling out. Those are consistently criticised, of course, by the Presbyterians and the non-conformists for having selling out, because of course the Anglicans have all the money. Right? Equally, there are people who start off. So, most famously, someone like John Smith. So John Smith, who started the General Baptist, this is before that time frame in the 1610s. He starts off as an Anglican minister, but over time he becomes disgusted by their opulence, and so he becomes part of separatism and nonconformity, and then goes even further into becoming part of a sect called the General Baptists, which becomes in part the Baptist that we have today. So you do see this kind of switch. More interestingly, though, is the dynamic of how lay people act.
Yep.
Okay, so like the thing about switching from the point of view of a pastor is there's money involved in that, of course, because you've got to go from whoever was paying you before, they're not paying you anymore, and is anyone else going to pay you to, switch sides, Whereas the fluidity of people in terms of like the lay people is just ridiculous. Like people would go to an Anglican, like there were people who were pure nonconformists, and there were people who were pure Anglicans. And to be honest, I've kind of made it a little black and white tonight for simplicity's sake. But there are actually lots of people who went to the Anglican service, did the bells and whistles that the Presbyterians and the nonconformists despised, and then went and heard a really good rousing sermon from the nonconformists and went, that sounds great. And then the next week they went to the Anglican service and then they flipped back and that kind of thing. One historian, I can't remember which one, he says they just followed a good rousing sermon wherever they could. And if the Anglicans in town had a really good sermon, they followed that. And if the Presbyterians had a good sermon, they went to that. And occasionally they'd hop down to the Baptists, have a good time, and then go around. That kind of thing.
What's wrong like podcasting?
Nothing.
Like podcasting today?
Yeah, that's a really good... I hadn't thought of that. Now that raises the other thing. The podcasting of this era is actually literature. This is like... one guy who wrote a book called Gangrena. No, it was Featley. Featley referred to how the presses sweat and groan under the weight of all of the literature being written at this point. And what that is people were writing books. And the thing is, people would read Presbyterian books, Anglican books, Baptist books arguing with Presbyterians, Presbyterians arguing with Anglicans, and round and round, and the Quakers would come in and then argue with that. And sometimes it's really useful, actually, from our perspective. For my thesis, I used a thing called EBO, Early English Books Online. And it has hundreds of thousands of books written during this period, all digitised now, which is awesome.
So Bunyan was, across both periods, was top seller after the Bible, I think, yeah.
Technically, he is one of the top sellers, but he's not one of the top sellers here. He's up there. Baxter's up there as well, and several others. The reason why he is so considered like one of the popular ones is because his didn't die out. For whatever fascinating reason, it's interesting to look at. Pilgrim's Progress just continues to be a bestseller for years and years and years and years and years, even to today. Whereas a lot of the books that were massive bestsellers here just aren't anymore. One of the most famous ones is a guy called Richard Baxter, who wrote a book called The Saints' Everlasting Rest, which is 700,000 words long. My PhD is 80,000 words long, to give you a sense of perspective, and it is entirely about death. It went through 7 reprints in its first year. No one's reading that now. But people are still reading Pilgrim's Progress.
Excerpts.
Yeah, excerpts. Yeah. Unfortunately, the excerpts are around about 100,000 words, but anyway. Yeah.
Look, just looking at that, by the time you throw in the geopolitical stuff that's happening if you had a well-trained army, you'd normally pay it by doing an excursion to Europe.
Yeah.
Against a Catholic group. And if there's one closer, then it stands to reason that Ireland would be attractive. I'd love to see your bar chart on popular approval for following the different...
Yeah.
I mean, there's just... It's such a complex situation.
If they had the
Yeah.
polls, it would have probably changed over a lot quicker than it did then.
But
When did the American movement when did they go to?
okay, so the Mayflower.
Yeah.
Mayflower's actually back in the earlier period, like the first decade or so. So
I've
I've
got a
actually
model of toleration.
Yeah, so toleration dynamics in America is another kettle of fish. And you get people like George Williams. Pennsylvania is started by William Penn, who's a Quaker, who's actually one of, I was talking about those regulators before.
Yeah.
He's one of the chief regulators. So he's one of, like, it's crazy. You get this Quaker who's best mates with a Catholic, right? So, yeah.
So you've got sort of some pressure releases that have got to go against that.
Yeah.
As well. Yeah.
You've got the West Indies, so that helps as a pressure valve. You have America to an extent, but there's a lot. It's not easy to go to America at this point, really. And then you've got wars with people like the French and the Dutch, but no one really wants to go to war against the French during this period because, well, Louis XIV's crazy, and he's really tough.
A lot of people, the Huguenots are coming the other way.
The other way, yeah. So, yeah. Now you had a question. What's that?
I sort of had two, I think, fairly quick ones. I just want to take you to task or query a bit. You're saying that if you are an absolutist, one of them, then you would actually be more open to asking, oh, who's right in discussion? Well, that's true, isn't it, if you're actually below the line? But is that true if you're above the line?
All right, so if you're in power, that's an excellent question. Right, so this is one of the reasons, this awesome question. So, this was one of my frustrations with how a lot of the history has been studied to this point. It's done from the perspective of those in power, right? So, magisterial toleration is what everyone talks about. Basically, should the government tolerate the religious minorities? No one's ever seriously, with all due respect to all the great scholars out there, none of them have seriously actually looked at how religious minorities tolerated each other, at times tolerated the government, so on and so forth. That was one of my points. But your point is really interesting in that a lot of the time, the arguments around whether the government should tolerate or not are actually in the literature, they're arguments made by Anglicans. They're made by Anglicans who either are intolerant or tolerant. But they're still Anglicans. They're still the ones in power. So they're actually arguing the question, should we tolerate them? And some, like John Locke, for example, argue, yeah, we should, for this reason and this reason, that are fairly abstract and theoretical. But the best arguments are not by the people in power as to whether they in power should actually give toleration to those minorities. It's actually by the minorities themselves. So the minorities, they present, when they're below the line, they present reasons why you should actually listen to us. And this comes to the other thing. You know who's not awesome at actually doing toleration well during this period? Baptists. Baptists are adamant that they support liberty of conscience, but they really struggle to know how to actually enact it. They give good reasons why everyone should tolerate them during this period, but they don't actually know they don't know how to effectively do it themselves. So I mentioned that quote before by Henry Cromwell. Well, I didn't bother saying this, but I'll go on. So after saying the whole thing of don't be deceived, he said this. Right? It's good to use tenderness towards them, tolerate the Baptists. I've done it, and shall still do it. But shall withal be careful to keep them from power, who, if they had it in their power, would express little tenderness to those that would not submit to their way. It's exactly your point. And that's actually one of the reasons why, when King Charles came back, things went so badly, so quickly for this bunch, because everyone went, we don't trust you. We don't trust you that when you're in power, you'll actually show toleration. Power corrupts. And absolute power corrupts absolutely. Right?
So if you apply that today,
Yep.
wouldn't the observation be that in certain parts of the world, in certain segments of society today, or in the West in general, more in the US and here, that you've got the mainline churches losing power and they're not doing so quietly?
They're not
doing so quietly, or at least they're afraid of the ramifications of that.
That is true.
That's actually probably, I should say they're more afraid. And therefore, this was me years ago, hopefully not now, and so that fear would lead to anger. And that's a lot of the time why you're seeing the rants and the crap and stuff you're seeing on Twitter and Facebook, as well as in other more formal media.
That is absolutely, totally fair enough. But I would also suggest that those who feel like they have been the oppressed minority in the past, once you find yourself in the ascendancy, you have to be really careful that you don't become the very thing that you despised not that long ago. Now, that's me saying that with the utmost respect and the utmost compassion to the injustices of them when they were the oppressed minority, right? Whoever that may be. But if you suddenly find yourself on the ascendancy, as the Baptists during the 1650s indicate, that is a powerful drug. Success and power is a powerful drug, and you just have to watch that in that process. I'm not accusing anyone of doing this. I'm just saying if you do find yourself in that position where you were persecuted minority and suddenly you're in the ascendancy and you hold power, be very careful that you don't actually become the very thing that you once despised.
You might not be accusing anybody, but I think Nietzsche did a very good job of predicting it.
Yeah.
There's a humorist who once...
Yep.
Yeah, I think what happens as well is when they get out of the persecution, there becomes a narrative about we don't want to go back.
Yeah.
So, it happened before, never again.
Right?
And that's sort of what happens.
Categorically, and that's the Anglicans' narrative.
Yeah.
So the Anglicans' narrative is we went through hell for 10 years because of these tools, because of these nutbags. The lunatics ran the asylum. And so, what is the main reason why when Charles is offering things like the Declaration of Breda, which says, bygones be bygones, as long as everyone's nice to each other, then you can have toleration. Why is it the Anglicans bring in, I didn't use the technical term for this, the Anglicans' series of laws during this period are called the Clarendon Code, and they include things like the Conventicle Act. You are not allowed to meet with more than 5 people at a time to discuss religious matters. After 1666, when you have the 65 and then 66, with the plague and the last plague of London and the Great Fire of London, they set up a thing called the 5 Mile Act, and that says that no pastor is allowed to go into the town within 5 miles of the town that he was once pastor of. They set up all these kind of rules. They set up the Licensing Act, which oppresses, tries to suppress all publications. And the reason why they put these very strident measures on and try to shut people up and squish down all these nonconformists is because of exactly what you just said and what you just said, which is, we will never let this happen again. And so increasingly, they actually use it quite explicitly as a boogeyman. They call it the good old cause. And they say, the good old cause is what these psychopaths did in 1650s, and we have to watch out that we don't let the good old cause rise again.
Did you say the GOC or the GOP?
No, I know what you were saying about the GOP. Yeah.
I was just saying that narrative, there's sort of 2 ways of looking at it. One is never again for anybody, and there's never again for us.
For us. And the Anglicans are quite... Actually, that's not fair. The Anglicans are quite clear on both. They say, never again for us. We will never relinquish control to Presbyterians or anyone, because they're idiots and nutbags. But then they also say, we know how bad Cromwell ran the country for 10 years. It sucked. He had no idea what he was doing. So, therefore, for the sake of the country, we will never let this happen again. Right? I mentioned the Monmouth Rebellion before. Part of the reason why James II hammers these guys so hard in the bloody Aziz, killing like hundreds of them, sending a ton of them off to Barbados and places like that, is because he says this is just this all over again. Okay, this is just the Civil War again. We got to stamp that out. Yep.
It seems to me that pretty well all those problems have gone away in Western societies over the last 70 odd years or so, at least, because of the separation of church and state. That we don't want religious groups to get into power anymore for the sort of reason you said, that power corrupts absolutely sort of thing. But the problem we're getting today is that Islam has got a different approach altogether. They don't really want to fit into our democratic system. They want to change our system of rules and all that sort of stuff. So they will systematically try and undermine our society, and the more of them we get in any culture, the more difficulties there'll be forever, probably. Okay, that's an interesting point. The issues around specifically Islam is something that I'd probably bow to someone like David Turnbull, who teaches here in intercultural studies a little bit more. But more broadly, the point that you're making is one around that I think it raises a very useful point in that often when we're talking about this kind of stuff, we think that we're talking about specifically Christian religious toleration, whereas the term that certainly the religious minorities they themselves used was actually liberty of conscience. And liberty of conscience is not about religious toleration, it's about ideological toleration. So what that should mean is, first of all, that we as Christians should tolerate other Christians, right? We tolerate other religions, yeah? But also we tolerate, in the sense of allowing to be part of the conversation, people who have no religious affiliation at all, namely agnostics and atheists. Right? But that ideological, once you actually stop it from being about religious toleration to actually making an ideological toleration, then it ceases to be just about a religious issue. It becomes about any perspective or philosophy about life, whether God's part of that equation or not, has to be like part of a society where, whether it's an atheistic one or a religious one or God or Allah or anything, that they're actually trying to find ways and mechanisms of working together in a unity, charity kind of way. You do you, we'll do us, and we'll have robust discussion where we allow each other to walk off and still believe, but actually that discussion is encouraged and facilitated. Now the question is, when what you try to do is you try to bring in unity of authority into any of those, whether it's Islam or anything else, does it actually end up working? And the reality is, historically, it doesn't. I mean, we've got a guy here from, how's that working out in the Middle East? Yeah. Somewhat problematically. Yeah.
It's funny, when I'm over there and you do talk to extremists about Islam, they sound exactly sort of like what you're saying. They'd say Christianity is trying to destroy us. They're trying to come here, they want to destroy our culture, they want to kill our children, they want to take our way of life, they want to promote homosexuality, everything. They say it's the same language, and then I say, oh yeah, but we're right. And I feel like saying that, it's because I'm a Christian, yet we're the good guys, so we can do that, but that doesn't work.
No.
They see us exactly like you're saying them, and that doesn't get far.
And the reality is that there is always a very small but very loud minority in any worldview that is really a bunch of tools who push their agenda unhelpfully for everyone else.
And get the airplay.
And get the airplay. And during this period, it's the people who are writing books and that kind of stuff. This is why ordinary toleration is so remarkable. Ordinary toleration, as scholars will explicitly say this, it's really hard to study because it's just what ordinary people are doing on the ground. And the reality is that in the midst of imams or pastors or whoever railing, or people on Twitter or in the Herald Sun or whatever ripping into each other,
The reality is there's actually a whole bunch of people who go to work and they work alongside people that they disagree with, and they come home, they have a good, robust discussion every now and then over lunch. Sometimes one of them decides to migrate over to the other one for a little while. Sometimes he stays there, so on and so forth. But that ordinary dynamic is actually one that is hard to see, but it's actually in a lot of ways more prevalent. Right?
And what's more, they support 16 different AFL teams.
Indeed they do. And what's interesting is that often we think that the intellectual arguments, the podcasts are the most important thing. You know, I mentioned John Locke. John Locke is widely regarded as the father of the philosophy of toleration. In 1689, he writes the book, the government's official reason for why it's going to be tolerant from now on. The hilarious thing is, he uses the exact same arguments he used in 1660 for why the government shouldn't tolerate. He uses the exact same arguments. He just flips them. He just completely flips them. And he takes it and the thing is, historians, they sit there and they go, what on earth happened to John Locke? What intellectual arguments did he have with other great intellectual minds that made him take these arguments that were against tolerating religious minorities in 1660 to now, 30 years later, showing toleration to them? No intellectual arguments. You know what happened? What happened was that he found himself in business with a group of people who were working in the Bahamas to make a lot of cash. And one of the main people running that with him, one of his partners, was a guy called William Kiffin, who was a Baptist pastor, one of the senior Baptist leaders, and also a renowned money-making machine. He was a brilliant merchant. And this was kind of like in about the 1670s. And so he comes into that and he goes, look, I don't think it's okay that I'm working with a Baptist, but he does make an awful lot of cash. And you actually, in his books, you can actually see he makes a stack of money in that business deal. Then after that, who's the main person that becomes a guarantor whenever he needs to get a loan through? William Kiffin. Whoever, if he needs to keep some money just taken care of and worked out and invested a little bit and then given back to him, who does he go to? William Kiffin. So suddenly, right, this guy goes from, I wouldn't trust any non-conformists if I could throw them, we shouldn't tolerate them, we should bash them all up, to 30 years later, no, they're not that bad, they're all good, it's okay. What's happened? He's had expressions of ordinary toleration. He's hung around with people, and all of his prejudices just don't work anymore. And so, that's my hope in all of this. My hope is that in the midst of all of the intellectual arguments and the podcasts and the railing and the Twitter sphere and everything like that, the fact is there are people who are walking down the street and they get to know their neighbours and they get to go to work and they go, actually, what that podcast said about so-and-so just ain't true. He's not actually like that. He's actually okay. And then, from a Christian point of view, they actually stop thinking that and they actually stop trusting that. They stop trusting the prejudices and caricatures that they hear in a podcast, and instead what they do is they know Phil. And Phil's a good guy, and Phil actually is admirable, and they get to know each other. And then Phil one day says, hey, why don't you come to church with me? And despite all of the voices ringing in his ears that Christians are terrible for this reason and that reason, he comes. And they go to Phil's church, everything's great, and he actually becomes a Christian. Right? Yep.
I think this is really useful, but it strikes me, I think, from what you said here, that there's a very narrow view of differences. Because even though you stretched it to ideology, right, once you bring in pluralism and you actually have the ethos where, and we're just as guilty of it because we want to evangelise, right? Well, Islam wants to spread its footprint as well. Mm. So charity, forget certain one now, charity takes two to tango.
Yeah, it does. That's true.
So how do you apply? Like, it seems like your model now has reached its end of its limitation by the time we get to the modern world, the internet, pluralisation, jet engine, etc.
The reality is that the least tolerant group in this whole thing loses. Right? Ultimately, the Anglicans lose. The Anglicans lose. They're the most intolerant bunch. They don't. So, like, the unity of charity becomes the mainstay after the toleration, the Act of Toleration, and the Toleration Act is vehemently attacked by Anglicans when it comes in at 1690. The reality is that Anglicanism goes into steady, inexorable decline for over a century from that point on. The only thing that even gives it a little bit of a pulse, a little bit of beep, beep, is Methodism, which is basically Puritan, is basically this dressed up as Anglicanism. So my point is that if you, part of what I think your argument is that it's all well and good to have this unity of charity unless someone else isn't charitable, right? Like, say they're seeking to persecute, such as Islam might.
Yeah.
The reality is the persecutors here lost.
Yeah, but that's because you've got such a narrow and so many commonalities. You've got commonality of language, commonality of culture, commonality, and they're only differing in one fairly, we would argue now, very narrow band. And so I'm just saying, I think that's a limit to what we can learn potentially from history here, because I think there is something new under that same soul.
Yeah, I don't know. Like, my hope is that people, ordinary people, will see the intolerance and persecution of others against people that they actually know and love, and that they go, Bob shouldn't be treated that way. Bob's not actually that bad of a bloke. And I think, based on this, and other examples actually throughout history, not least of all the Roman Empire, that actually what you'll find is that people will feel an empathy and a sympathy for the Bobs of this world, the Christians of this world, who are actually treated harshly. Right? That's my hunch. Now, I could be historically wrong. I could be futuristically wrong, but the history for me is one of, in the long game, the persecuted ultimately engender more sympathy than the people who think that they're killing for the sake of God or righteousness or for the right reasons or whatever. That's just my...
I'm not arguing that. I'm just saying I think there's a limit because of pluralism, because of modernism, because of the technology that is new, that is actually bringing more disparate peoples and plunging them closer together. I just think, I think this is wonderful. I'm just sitting here nodding most of the night.
Yeah.
I just think at that point, there's a limit to what can be applied from history to current.
That's a really interesting point, and that raises something else, and I would happily talk about that at another talk. Mm-hmm. So yes.
At this stage, I think we'd better close things off.
Yep.
On Sunday mornings, I go to a Baptist church.
Yep.
In the evening, I go to an Anglican church. I'm hoping that God is either an Anglican or a Baptist. Is there any hope for me?
Well, as long as you are faithful, show charity, compassion, justice, all of that good character stuff, I'm sure it'll be okay.